Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We're thrilled to have you with us and to be joined by the author of our book club event and also the librettist of our opera, who I'll be introducing here shortly. First and foremost, welcome to our book club event surrounding intelligence. As you know, we're in the process of rehearsing for this opera, which is seeing its East Coast premiere in just about a week in Norfolk, and then it goes on to Richmond and Fairfax. Performances January 30th and February 1st in Norfolk, February 6th and 8th in Richmond, and then the 14th and 15th of February in Fairfax. So if you don't have your tickets, please get them. They're going fast, and there's been a lot of interest in this production and the wonderful cast that we've assembled. I want to remind you that there was a world premiere album that was released just last fall through a partnership between Houston Grand Opera and LSO Live, and it was recently nominated for Best Opera Recording at the 2026 Grammy Awards. In fact, those awards are about a week away, and so we're all keeping our fingers crossed for Jake and Jean and Houston Grand Opera to get that win. So best wishes to them. A little bit about the format of this evening's program. You're going to have about 15 to 20 minutes with our author of the book, Southern Lady Yankee Spy. That book's sitting over there. And then we're going to have about 15 to 20 minutes with Gene Scheer, who is our librettist for intelligence. And then we'll gather both of them together and have a few back and forth questions. And then we're going to open it up to the rest of you for an audience Q&A. And we're very pleased to welcome Elizabeth Varon. Elizabeth, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hang on.
Great.
Yeah. Hey, how you doing?
Hi, Liz. Great. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks for being with us this
Oh,
evening.
my pleasure.
I just have there's a quick bio I want to read to let people know who you are and
Great.
before we get started.
Sure.
Elizabeth Varon is a historian and a professor of American history at the University of Virginia. She previously was professor at the University of Oxford, Wellesley College, and Temple University, and co-director of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Specialist in the Civil War era and 19th century South, Varon is the author of 6 books, including Longstreet, The Confederate General Who Defied the South, Appomattox, Victory, Defeat, and Freedom at the End of the Civil War, Disunion, and Southern Lady Yankee Spy, the true story of Elizabeth Van Lew, a Union agent in the heart of the Confederacy. And we are so pleased to have you with us this evening.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, number one, I just want to say I love the book.
Oh, thank you.
It's revealed so much of the history behind this opera that we've been working on for several weeks, and really looking forward to. And I wondered if you could maybe start us off with telling us a little bit more about your background and how you got so deeply ingrained in the Civil War in the South, into that specialty.
Yeah, that's a great question. I grew up in Northern Virginia, lots of battlefields and history, very easily accessible there, Mount Vernon, Manassas, Bull Run, and all the rest. And both my parents were immigrants, my father from Turkey and my mother from Germany. And they found themselves in the Washington, D.C. area because of my dad's job. And they wanted to get to know this place, Virginia, which they found themselves. They didn't know from Virginia. So they were very deliberate about taking me and my brother to all of the historic sites. They were both history buffs and came from countries with very rich, complicated histories. And so they took they took us around to these places, and it was being on site, at these historic sites that really got me on the history jag, as it were. That sort of uh, fantasy of time travel that love of history always sort of begins with, what would it have been like? Those questions fascinated me. And as for the Civil War, I remember very distinctly in early memories of watching some television show that described the Civil War as a brothers' war that divided families. Family members might find themselves on separate sides. And that's the theme of the opera. And that captured my imagination in part because I had this small nuclear family. All my relatives were abroad. I was very close to my own brother. He was my best friend. I thought as a kid, like, what would pit you against your own brother? I can't imagine something, so terrible, you know? So that got me interested in that question. And then living somewhat on the border of the North and South up there in Northern Virginia is Northern Virginia the South. It's in sort of in the eyes of the beholder, something that many perspectives are possible on. That was I had an interest in Southern history, understanding Southern identity from a rather young age. And then finally, my mother was very active in Virginia politics in Northern Virginia, and I got interested in the long history of women's involvement in politics and wrote a PhD dissertation on white Virginia women and their involvement in party politics and in the slavery debates and so on. And I kept running across Van Loo's name in the course of doing that work, and that just made me want to know more.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is what initially drew you to Elizabeth Van Loo, this specific story and this courageous player in the broader Civil War narrative.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. I mean, oftentimes interest in a subject derives from a certain dissatisfaction with the received wisdom. It just doesn't ring true in some ways. And I kept running across references to Van Lewis' Crazy Bet. And she's this fascinating character who is both sort of was certainly to a larger degree 25, 30 years ago, unknown to the broad American public, but sort of well known to Civil War buffs and to Richmonders, but also cloaked in myth. And, she was sort of remembered in stories that were passed down as Crazy Bet. And this was an argument or an image of her as someone who succeeded in her espionage work because she pretended to be unhinged and crazy and unreliable, and that because she was successful at that, she was able to somewhat broadcast her unionism and go sort of unmolested by the authorities. And sort of corollary part of the myth was that it came easy to her to pretend she was crazy because she was, in fact, a kind of erratic and irrational woman. And having also, gleaned all of the achievements of her spy network, it just never added up to me that people, their fellow agents, particularly the African American ones, would trust her with their lives, and that U.S. Grant would trust her as a, head of an espionage ring and so on, if she was erratic or perceived as erratic, I was always a little suspicious of that. I've always been interested in sort of political mavericks, people who don't do what's expected, don't hew to convention, and she was certainly one of those. So a very, tempting target for a biographer, for all those reasons. A very unusual woman. I was also interested to know, all biographers have to both make a case for the exceptionalness of their subjects, of why are they worthy of our effort and of the reader's time and so on, what makes them stand out. But you also want to ask questions about their representativeness so that they aren't just aberrations and anomalies and so on. And so I knew she was a Southern Unionist, someone who supported the Union in the Civil War, and I wanted to know more about that phenomenon. And much of my subsequent career has been dedicated to finding out more and more about dissent within the South, and just tradition of dissent within the South, the role of these Southern Unionists in the war effort.
Well, I'm curious if you could. I'm hoping that many of the members of our audience have read the book, or if they haven't read it, they're in the process of reading it. But for those who haven't quite finished it, could you give us kind of a Reader's Digest of the
Yeah.
elevator pitch? What
Yeah,
of
the
the story?
elevator pitch is that this is a woman whose espionage activity as the head of an interracial underground in Civil War Richmond, the heart of the Confederacy, the belly of the beast, really made a difference, that it made the spy work made a tactical and strategic and symbolic difference to the Union authorities as they are trying to lay siege to Richmond and capture the Confederate capital. Van Lew is literally able to get them um, intelligence details that they can factor into their strategies about deploying forces along that siege line in the last year of the war. But she's also helping U.S. Grant to know that his strategy of attrition, of wearing the Confederacy down, is working. She's able to report about conditions from inside Richmond, demoralization, inflation, manpower shortages, and so on, and to say, keep at it. She also represents for Northerners the hope that there are Southerners, that there's a latent unionism, a patriotism that can be rekindled to rebuild the nation. She helps keep that dream alive. She represents this, again, a tradition of dissent, and really, in the largest sense, she's a reminder that the American Civil War was a war of the South against the South. I mean, in our shorthand, we say, the North won, the South lost. Well, what South? The South was not the same as the Confederacy. Black Southerners were Unionists. They wanted the Union to win. They worked for Union victory, figures like Mary Jane Richards and many others. And Southern Unionism, both the sort of work that Van Lew did, and then the enlistment in the Union Army of many, many men, 450,000 men from slave states fought in the Union Army. And when you appreciate that, when you realize that most of the 200,000 black men who fought in the Union Army were Southerners who had escaped slavery to fight for the Union Army, this whole question of the very, way we think about the war is it demands that we reconsider it.
Well, I'm so curious. You mentioned the role of formerly enslaved people in the war effort, and also as a part of this interracial kind of spy network. Um, one of the other characters in the opera is, as you mentioned, Mary Jane Richards, a pivotal character. Could you speak a little bit? I know that she's not the main topic of your book, but the book is now, this was written in 2003, I think it was first published, right? And so there's been of a lot of lore, I think, that has been uncovered even since then
Yeah,
about
yeah,
Mary.
yeah. It's a fascinating story. So, one of the things I felt I had to do in this book, because both Van Lew and Mary Jane Richards were spies, were trying to keep their activity clandestine. I mean, doing historical research is always hard, but when you're trying to uncover the work of people who were trying to keep the work secret, that's a special challenge. I felt I had to work backward a little bit from the post-war sources where I could see things clearly to find clues that were going to help me navigate the wartime stuff. And in the case of Mary Jane Richards, we had some post-war references, a newspaper article, some comments by Van Lew's niece that suggested that a woman named Mary Elizabeth Bowser had been a spy in Van Lew's network and had gotten access to the Confederate White House. But over time, this had become like a game of telephone, as we used to say, where these things were repeated, but the original source of that information, and in the moment sources from the Civil War that might confirm and flesh out the story, were elusive. So, in the course of doing research about Van Lew, I wanted to learn more about Mary Elizabeth Bowser. And I happened upon in newspapers I was reading a reference to a Mary Jane Richards, whose life mapped on to what we had been told about Mary Elizabeth Bowser, that she'd been an enslaved person in the Van Lew household, had been sent to Liberia for an education, or rather sent north for an education, and then colonized to Liberia, had come back to Richmond, had run afoul of the authorities because once you had been freed and left Virginia as an enslaved person, you weren't allowed to come back, had remained on in the Van Lew household in a kind of secret freedom, and then worked as a key member of this interracial spy network. All of those data points, biographical points, um, uh, turned out to be the story of someone named Mary Jane Richards. Mary was the consistent part. Mary Elizabeth Bowser, Mary Jane Richards, Mary Richards Denman. These are different names for the same person. She used it's both of reflecting some of her marriages, but also the use of aliases to protect her own privacy. So, uh, having discovered that Mary Jane Richards is a name that appears in the records, I then looked to Freedmen's Bureau records and American Colonization Society records and other records to try to flesh out the story. And I did as best I could. I knew that, knew and hoped that others would come along and continue. The leads I'd uncovered would continue to yield further leads. Some years after I finished the book, I got an email from the Library of Virginia, a wonderful archive in Richmond, saying, "Hey, one of our researchers found this newspaper article in which someone calling herself Richmonia Richards gives a speech in New York in 1865 after the war, in which she describes getting access as a spy to the Confederate White House." And this was a huge find because still we hadn't found a source from, within the war years or the immediate aftermath that put Mary Jane Richards in the Confederate White House. But here was a speech in her own voice doing so. So that was a whole series of leads. A wonderful novelist and historian named Lois Levine is now writing a book about Mary Jane Richards, and she has found out yet more about Mary Jane Richards in a period of her life in Georgia in which she was going by the name Mary Richards Denman because she'd married a white Union soldier. And so, and she will have uncovered all kinds of additional things. The through line is that Mary Jane Richards Bowser Denman was an incredibly courageous person who took all kinds of risks to do this work, and who continued after the war as a teacher, as a working for the Freedmen's Bureau to combat racism wherever she saw it.
Yeah, I think in fact there was a wonderful. I encourage everyone on the call tonight. There was a fabulous panel discussion. I think at the it was with Lois Levine and Ed Ayers
Yeah,
back
yeah,
in
yeah,
2013. I watched that a couple weeks ago and just it was a revelation because I
yeah,
after reading your book, this is 10 years into the future.
yeah.
And I would recommend everybody go to C-SPAN, seek this out. It's a fabulous conversation and really interesting questions from the audience. That's now, 12 years, 13 years
Right,
ago.
right,
And
right.
I'm wondering, if there's even further. I'm excited to see
Yeah,
what
I
Lois.
mean, in a way, the what happens is we discover more primary sources. We also discover sort of analytical paradigms. There's been all kinds of great work on African American women in the Civil War in the past, 20 years by Thavolia Glimpf and others, a great scholar at Duke. And among the many findings that put all this story in new perspective are that first of all, when we talk about Black Southern Unionism, we have to talk about women as well as men. Easier to measure in the case of men because we have men in blue uniforms, the famous, USCT regiments, heroic regiments. But women also aid the Union war effort. Harriet Tubman, famous scout and spy, is the most famous example, but just one among many. Susie King Taylor, a nurse and camp follower, Harriet Jacobs, and Elizabeth Keckley, raising money for Black refugee communities. There's literally countless examples, and one of the points that Glimpf and others make is that even those who didn't, for example, flee slavery to make it to Union lines, those who were forced to remain behind on farms and plantations that the army didn't liberate, small acts of resistance helped to destabilize slavery. So to understand Mary Jane Richards as a Black Southern Unionist, whose contributions as a Black Southern Unionist are as important as part of the picture as the contributions of USCT soldiers, is sort of where we're at now, understanding this important phenomenon.
At a recent, we did a discussion about a week, 2 weeks ago, I can't remember now, but it was a panel discussion with historians from Norfolk State and Old Dominion. in Norfolk. And this it was about Elizabeth Van Lew, about Mary Jane, and just this period in history, kind of reminding all of us the Civil War, when it happened, what were the
Right,
bullet
right,
points,
right, right.
And one of the really interesting questions that came up that I wanted to ask you was, are there any direct tactical wins for the North that came out of the intelligence collected by Mary, Jane, or Elizabeth that you're aware of?
Yeah, I don't think it was a single tactical win. In the last year of the war, Um, Grant is laying siege to Richmond along this Richmond-Petersburg siege line of 30 odd miles, and Lee is trying to deploy his remaining chess pieces, as it were, on two fronts here in this Richmond Petersburg corridor and then in the Shenandoah Valley. And Van Lew and her team are able to tell Grant um, where Lee is putting those chess pieces. And the spy tradecraft is very primitive but effective. So Van Lew's agents, she has members of the underground, black and white, who are traveling from her Richmond mansion to City Point, the federal headquarters of Grant's siege campaign, on a daily basis. I mean, he gets fresh flowers from her garden every morning. Uh, Carrying messages in the hollowed out eggs in the soles of their shoes and written in cipher. And Van Lew has agents standing at the train station in Richmond, and when a bunch of Confederate soldiers get on a train headed to the west, she knows, well, that's a regiment that was redeployed, and that means this part of the line. So Grant is able to strike some blows as part of the long siege along the siege line that are informed by the information he's getting. But I think that the point about saying, Grant, your strategy of attrition is working. The Confederacy, is rumors of collapse are roiling the city. They are herding old men and young boys into the army. People can't feed themselves. Keep at it. This is an important message for Grant because in this very period in the war, he's under fire in the North, in Northern public opinion, especially among anti-war Democrats, saying this isn't working, Grant. Grant's a butcher. He's sacrificing Union men, to no avail. And so Van Lew is able to say that, this is working. And that is it's more strategic than tactical, but it really does make a difference.
Well, one of the stories you tell so beautifully, and it's a heartbreaking story of Ulrich Dahlgren, that comes up towards the end of the book, and it's one of those failed attempts that
Right.
does not go well, but it really shines a light on the humanity of what Elizabeth was doing and
Yeah,
the
that's
respect, the
right.
care. It's that's I just was it was so illuminating and giving us more access to her
Well,
person,
it's also, something like that unnerves the Confederates. So the story of Dahlgren, he's killed in leading a raid against Richmond. The Confederates believe that his mission was to assassinate Jefferson Davis. So they mutilate his body and give it a sort of dog's burial in an unmarked grave. Somehow Van Lew and her agents figure out where the grave is. They disinter him and they give him a respectful burial, a good death as they understood it in the 19th century, surrounded by friends and supporters who can testify that he was, ready to meet his maker and all that. They give him a respectful burial on the farm of a Unionist. Meanwhile, Dahlgren's father, who's an admiral, is imploring the Confederate government to give the body of his dead son back to him, to the Dahlgren family. This was a courtesy that was sometimes done in the case of officers. And the Confederates finally relent. When they go to dig up the body to send it back to the father, it's not there. And that, so to them, that's the great resurrection, as some of them called it, nervously. It seemed that Van Lew and her crew were miracle workers, and so this is, essentially this Southern Unionism, especially by someone like Van Lew. It's not going to by itself turn the tide of the war. That happens on the battlefield, but creates a series of brush fires that the Confederates have to devote resources to putting out. Again, in that sense, it really makes a difference. I should, also would be remiss if I didn't emphasize in answer to your question about the difference it makes. The head of the whole Union intelligence operation will say, in what is perhaps the most meaningful tribute to Van Lew and by extension to everyone in that network, Richards included, he would write after the war that For a time, Van Loo represented all that was left of the power of the federal government in the city of Richmond during the war. That's what she represented. And that, what is that? That's the hope of victory. That's the hope of reunion. This is at a time before women can vote or hold office. It's really quite a remarkable testament.
Well, I can't thank you enough for leading off the conversation this evening and joining us. I hope that you'll stick around for
Of
a couple
course.
more questions.
Yeah.
I'm gonna unmute, I guess mute you but I'll bring you back in
Okay, great.
here
Thank you.
shortly. Thanks a lot.
Sure thing.
Um, and I'm going to then welcome in Gene Scheer, our librettist for the opera Intelligence. Gene, I think I've converted you to a panelist here in the webinar. You're probably hopping on as we speak. There he is, Gene Scheer. Welcome.
Hi. Hi. Can you hear me?
Hey,
Good.
great to see you. Great to
Good to
see
see
you.
you too. Good to see you as well.
Before we get started, Gene, I just want to give a brief bio, a synopsis of who you are for our audience
Sure.
tonight. Gene Scheer is an acclaimed American librettist, known for his versatility and his emotionally resonant texts, praised by audiences, critics, and collaborators alike. He's principally known for his work on 12 full-length operas, including high-profile collaborations with composer Jake Heggie, Moby Dick, Three Decembers, It's a Wonderful Life, Intelligence, If I Were You, and To Remain, to name a few. Tobias Picker for Thérèse Raquin, An American Tragedy, Joby Talbot, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, Everest, and composer Jennifer Higdon with Cold Mountain. The past 10 months have been a remarkable time for Gene. Moby Dick premiered at the Metropolitan Opera last spring in 25, and then earlier this fall, the Met opened their 25-26 season with a new opera that Gene co-wrote with composer Mason Bates, and that was, of course, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And Gene is a composer in his own right as well. He's written for a number of songs for every notable singer you can think of, Renee Fleming, Larry Brown. I could go down the list. But his song, American Anthem, performed by Nora Jones, was featured in Ken Burns' Emmy-winning PBS documentary, The War. I could go on and on and on, but Gene, we're so thrilled to have you with us this evening.
Thank you so much, and I'm thrilled to be with you and to get a chance to thank Elizabeth for that fantastic book, which was pivotal in the writing of this opera. It's the it's the best real telling of what actually happened, and it was so beautifully researched and written. So thank you, Elizabeth. Or I'll get a chance to see her face and thank her again. But
Yeah.
it was a great way to with all the research I did. It was a pivotal source.
Well, Gene, I'm curious if you can maybe elaborate a little bit about yourself. What what draws a person to creating the libretti for opera? Is it the money and the fame and the glory?
Right. Okay.
Is that what it is?
That's an easy thing to say no to. No, it's not that, of course. No, I've been a passionate, if you backward engineer my life, it makes sense. I was a classical musician. I was an opera singer wannabe. I went to the Eastman School of Music, and I always say I was like a AAA baseball player. I was quite good, but I couldn't quite hit the fastball when I got out into the real world. And but I was good, and I had been working. I started working or in professional theater because I was a good actor and had a good voice. So I worked in musical theater. And while I was doing that, I started writing to keep my soul alive. I did for 10 years, I was performing consistently in musical theater in Europe. And always dreaming that I would wind up being back in the opera world someday. And the long and short of it is I wrote a lot of stuff to keep my soul alive while I was doing all these musicals. And when I came back to the States, the writing eclipsed the performing, and I would always I was oh, had always been interested in I was a sort of a literary kid, but even more than that, I was a theater kid and a music kid, and then so I knew all about what opera was, having studied it, having performed it in college and a little bit, and then lots of Gilbert and Sullivan and such professionally. So I had lots of experience in being a theater person, but I was always intrigued by the possibility of storytelling and music and what happened just to in a nutshell, is that I wrote a bunch of songs. Nathan Gunn, a famous singer, Denise Graves, Renee Fleming, people were singing my songs. And Nathan introduced me to Francesca Zambello, who is a very prominent director, still is, who runs the Washington National Opera now, but she's done various things in her career. Um, Introduced me to Tobias Picker, and I wrote Therese. I was asked to write Therese Racan, the Zola novel, and that sort of kicked it off. And the next thing I know, my second opera was for the Metropolitan Opera with Tobias and American Tragedies, and I've been doing this for I guess 30 years now, or 25, 30 years now. So it's been a hell of a ride, and it's been great. I've been getting to write for people, including the people you have in your cast, by the way, this time, who are friends and fantastic singers that I always dreamed of performing with. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
I love it. Gene, I think I first met you in Central City,
Yeah, yeah.
and you were performing. You were taking a break from performing, but I think that summer you were actually finishing the libretto of Moby Dick,
I think that might have been
in
true.
between
Yeah,
performances of Allie Hackham in
yeah.
Oklahoma.
Ali Ho, and yes,
Ah,
yes, indeed,
that was
With Maureen
fantastic.
McKay, who's in your company now,
Maureen, who's in our cast right now.
who's a
That's right.
phenomenal talent. Yeah, so it was great. Yeah.
Well, my first experience with your libretto was actually Three Decembers, and I
Mhm.
had the great privilege I've performed that piece now 3 or 4 times, and then I've also been able to work with you and Jake on a workshop for If I Were You, an opera you wrote a few years back.
Mhm.
Can you tell our audience how did the two of you come together? You're one of the most prolific partnerships in modern day opera, and I'm just curious, what was
I
that
can tell
initial
you,
spark?
I can tell you how it happened. Chris Jepson, the fantastic mezzo soprano, Chris Jepson, who has tragically passed away from cancer, lived much too short a time. But she was a good friend of mine in New York. She was a person who sang. For those who don't know, she was a great, great singer, and she sang at the Met, among other places. And she knew Jake because she had been Susan Graham's understudy for Dead Man Walking when it premiered in 2000 or wherever that was in San Francisco. And then she went on to do the Dead Man many, many times. But she and Jake became good friends. And a lot of the people I just mentioned, Nathan Gunn, Christine Gerke, Stephanie Blythe, when they were just starting at the Met and just starting their careers, they all knew Chris. I knew them mostly through Nathan. So Chris and I became friends. And she said, you guys should work together. You guys, she put us together. And Jake, when he was in need of a librettist because a particular project wasn't going well, he called me and said, "Would you do this project?" I did wind up not doing that project for logistics, but then that started our conversation. And in 2005, it was the same year as the Metropolitan Opera premiere of American Tragedy. At the same time, we premiered our first piece, which was called Statuesque for Joyce Castle, who just turned 87, by the way, yesterday,
Wow.
2 days ago. But this was a while ago, and so we wrote a song cycle called Statuesque, and um, and that was I'm guessing at the numbers, but that was 20 pieces ago, and I mean including song cycles. We've written 50, 60 songs together. For very prominent folks. Joyce DiDonato has done a lot of our work, and among others. And so that it's an ongoing collaboration. We're writing a new piece right now for the Napa Music Festival, which is going to premiere next summer. So it's been a great joy. Obviously, as you mentioned, I work with other people and very happily. But Jake is certainly definitely the home harbor
Yeah.
for my creative uh, output.
Well, you answered one of my questions, which was what's next. So that's very good.
Yeah.
We'll be curious to see that. But how about the genesis of this specific opera? How did you get the kernel
Sure.
for intelligence? Where did this come from?
Well, I actually just mentioned someone's name who was involved in this. It was Susan Graham. Susan Graham, who is a fantastic singer and one of the great American singers of the last 25, 30 years, without question. Jake and I had written a song cycle for her called Iconic, which we called Iconic Legacies. We were commissioned to do a piece connected to the Smithsonian Institution, in which I took items from the Smithsonian that were associated with first ladies. Marian Anderson's the mink coat, with Eleanor Roosevelt, the hat with the mourning band on it that belonged to Lincoln, from the child Willie that they lost, that sent the Smithsonian, and I wove texts, or inspired by these relationships between these particular items and first ladies, and it was premiered by Susan Graham. And Jake and I were in at the Kennedy Center. We were doing an event, actually publicizing the work that was about to be premiered. And at the end of this event, when we talked about what we were going to do, the piece and how it started, and it told you all the stories about the various items from the Smithsonian. A docent who from the Smithsonian who was there went up to Jake. I was unbeknownst to him. I didn't see it happen. He went up to Jake and said, I have the subject for your next opera." And in our business, let me tell you, that happens quite a lot. And someone says, "I have," and most of the time, honestly, you're very polite and very, try to be very gracious, but they're not great ideas. He said, "Do you know the story of Mary Jane?" I think he said Mary Jane Bowser, and Elizabeth Van Loo. And Jake said, "No, I don't." He said, "Well, you should learn about it, and that should be your next opera." And he walked away. And we don't know who that person is, by the way. We don't know his name. So we
Well,
got
by the
into it.
way, we're going to be performing not far from the Kennedy Center in, a few weeks. So maybe this
Maybe
person will
maybe this
show
person will
up.
come and say, "I it was my idea," and it was someone's idea. And so we got into an Uber going back to the hotel, and we started Googling, and there was an article in the New York Times, and so we thought, well, maybe this is a legitimate story. There was an op-ed piece that was written about Elizabeth Van Loo and Mary Jane Bowser, who's who I called, although as Elizabeth said, she had many names for all the reasons that Elizabeth cited. Um, and so we started doing research, and we were sort of dumb, we were uh, amazed that we didn't know who this person was. We didn't know this story. But then, how many stories of women, let alone black women, and have been folded into history in places where it's hard to find them. So that's it's until historians like Elizabeth come along to unearth them. So it's so we started. I started doing research about it, and we started. And so I read many all the books I could find, not the least of which, the most pivotal one was Elizabeth's book. And then and I talked to people who knew a lot about the story. I went to the Confederate White House. I went to Richmond. I talked to uh, guides, people who were passionate about it, people who were writing novels about it, people who had just I just tried to get as much information as I could, and tried to discern uh, what happened was historically accurate, what was part of the lore, what was part of the actual history, but also not knowing, and I'm sure this is something that would, you'd be interested in, your audience would be interested in, that fact that we're not doing a documentary, we're writing a work of art. And the way I like to say it is that our job is, we're in the business of emotional archaeology, is what we are. We're trying to not explain necessarily what happened, but what it felt like. And in fact, there's even a line in the opera that I put as, "I just know it sounded like this," and in terms of the grief that people were experiencing in the war, and and what had happened in the history of slavery in Black America. And so the more I learned about the story, I just thought this is a great story to explore, and a great sort of point of departure to explore personal issues, not just the political issues. Of course, I knew it would be interesting. The espionage aspect of this story would be intriguing and dramatic. But in the end, things are really, you have to care about the characters on stage, the people on stage, and what's the personal relationships. That was the thing that I was really trying to mine in this, and also that the story to me suggested really an interesting relationship between these two women, and that is principally what the opera is about. is about the relationship between this um, good white woman, but empowered white woman, and this very smart black woman who's had this extraordinary life. I mean, the pillars of this story are just, that she was baptized in that white church, that she went up, was sent up north to be educated. This happened, from as I understand it, and then came back to Richmond. Then she went to Liberia for these 5 years, and then she came back and she went on the eve of the Civil War. She came back to Richmond, and the thing which struck me, and of course you were mentioning that Elizabeth, new research has come out since she wrote her book. New research has come out since I wrote the opera, which yeah. So and but when I was writing it, I was struck by the fact that, as I just said, she went up north outside of Philadelphia to be educated, came back. She went to Liberia, came back. Now, after the war is ending, she goes and she never comes back. So I said, what was the what occasioned that? What was the what caused this potential rift or between them? And it made me think. And then, of course, there's the issue that Mary Jane didn't know, presumably, who her mother was, and and born into the Van Loo household as a slave, as a child, and Elizabeth Van Loo's family was incredibly rich, so this hardware fortune and such. So I'm going on and on, Adam, but
No, this
but
is
I
this
got
is
excited about it because it's an incredible story. But it's the thing which I think is compelling about it, hopefully is compelling about it, and it really is in Jake's music, is that you really wind up caring deeply about the people, and you're watching these interpersonal relationships unfold.
Well, that's true. And you've answered about three of
Yeah.
my questions
Oh,
in,
sorry, I
in
guess.
the
Yeah.
midst of all that. It's great
Yeah.
because, I was struck in 2023. I attended the world premiere and I was there with a friend and we were sitting in the front row and I had no idea what intelligence was other than
Right.
I'd seen a lot of like the New York Times preview article, things that have been
Right.
coming out and the buzz around it. And I thought, well, what is this Civil War story about these two women I know nothing about? And so I intentionally did not prepare myself all
Hmm.
that much because I wanted to I wanted
Sure.
to be like a normal audience member at the
Right.
opera.
Right.
And I went and I was blown away by the music, by the drama, by the production, by the dance element.
Yeah.
That's something I've
Hmm.
never seen in opera before. But also the history that in Kentucky they didn't teach this
Yeah.
history,
Right.
and I was just blown away by all of it. And so but then also was sitting there in Texas saying, "What on earth is Texas doing with our story? We have to bring
Right.
this home to Virginia," which
I'm
is
so
why
glad
we've
you
done
did.
it.
Yeah, the other thing is, I have to say, it's like the scale of it. I mean, an intimate is really an intimate story. When you think there are seven characters on stage, that's it. I mean, I just did Cavalier Clay at the Met. We had 90 people on stage. I mean, this is a very intimate story, with big ramifications, big emotional ramifications, and big, obviously, political ramifications in terms of the storytelling. But that's why I think it's a perfect. You guys are the perfect place to do this. Not of course, it's being done in Virginia where the story took place, but also the intimacy that you can bring to it is crucial, I think, and will actually serve the piece beautifully, really, really well. I'm
Well,
looking forward to
thanks,
seeing it.
Gene. I'm excited for you to see it. Let's bring Elizabeth back into the room with us here and have a little conversation. I'm excited for the two of you to meet, even if it's virtually.
Hey, wonderful to meet you, Jean.
Nice to meet you, Elizabeth. And again, thank you for your wonderful book, and it's incredible. It was.
Wait a
It's been. I
minute.
have to say, it's been a long time since I read it because a lot of projects ago. But I remember it was when you were talking about Dahlgren. Was that I know all of a sudden it was coming
Yeah.
back to me. I had forgotten that part of the story, and all of a sudden I was saying, God, do I remember that? And yes, I did remember it as you were telling the story. Yeah. So.
Can you, yeah, I appear, seem to be frozen in my, oh no, there I
Oh,
am.
Oh,
I'm
there
back.
you are.
now
You're
you're
back.
back.
Yeah.
Now you're
Yeah.
back.
All right. All
Great.
right. Now I'm
Good.
back. Good. Okay.
You were
Um,
frozen with a beautiful smile, though.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's whatever. It's a wonderful occasion. It's better to
Mhm.
be
Yeah.
somewhat animated, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious. I have a question for you. There, both of you. There's a new Amazon Prime series. I don't know if you've heard about this, but
No.
at the end of February, there's a brand new Amazon Prime series it's premiering called The Gray House, and it's a mini series produced by Kevin Costner and Morgan Freeman. It
Hmm.
tells the true story of a secret network of female spies who played a crucial role during the American
There you
Civil
go.
War.
Ah,
We're on the zeitgeist here. There you go.
And
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I think actually it's Elizabeth Van Loo. Her mother, Eliza, is played by
Hmm.
Mary Louise Parker. Uh,
Ah, all right.
Mary Jane Richards, Mary Bowser. I
Mm.
don't know what they plan to name her in the production,
Yeah, right.
but that's coming out, and I'm curious. Well, since you're both surprised, I guess they did not consult either one of you. What on
No,
earth?
no, 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 no,
No,
no.
I
I,
don't.
I,
Yeah,
I haven't. Hollywood is its own thing. I have nothing to. Lord knows I have nothing to do with it. But
yeah.
um,
Hollywood is its own thing. Is
yeah, yeah,
all that needs to be said about that.
yeah. Uh, but they're
I hope
wonderful
it's
art.
good. You know.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
hope it's good. They're
yeah,
wonderful artists,
yeah.
and
Of course.
Kevin, he writes. He's been involved in good projects, so
Yeah, of
here's
course.
hoping it's wonderful. And they have the benefit of some more research that they have a benefit of Elizabeth research and all the stuff that came out since I wrote the opera.
Yeah.
So
Well, a question to you both, especially for Jean and then to Liz as well for the history behind this. There's one character in the opera. It's Elizabeth's sister-in-law. Her real name was Mary, and I assume, Jean, that for practical reasons you
amen. You
can't
got
have too
the
many Marys
I
in
had
one
too many
show.
Marys, so I changed her name to Callie. I
You
just
changed
couldn't.
it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of
It was
course.
impossible. It's like Mary one, Mary two, Mary three is not gonna work in the opera. So
Yeah, yeah. And that might be a reason the mother's doesn't not I mean the mother was still alive throughout the entire time, but you maybe didn't want
I
you can
did.
only select so many characters.
Yeah, you only, you need to focus the audience's attention and this. It's just a question of storytelling. Again, I'm not doing a documentary. I'm not. This is not about this happened, then this happened, and so forth. And it's a question of. And I was focused on the story. Jake and I focused on the story that we wanted to tell, which includes, of course, the intelligence gathering. And because Elizabeth Van Loo's everything I'm about to say or have said is based on Liz's book, but it really was. I mean, the thing that I was struck by was like Grant going to her house and sitting on the porch with her, as I understand it, and also and pointing her the postmaster general of Richmond after the war. I mean, there was some significant she had some significant part in this effort and so it's without knowing exactly we can't for the reasons Liz cited you can't they were trying to hide it and the fact that it's a black women in general in terms of the history of the country how it's not it's been folded away but I just, it's an amazing story, and can't wait to see it again.
Liz, can you tell us a little bit more about that sister-in-law and
Yeah.
what happened to
You
her?
know, the sister-in-law is a Confederate who is suspects that Elizabeth and her mother are up to no good, and eventually, points the finger at them, and the provost marshal comes and investigates the household and the family. Interestingly, there's no reference to Van Loo being crazy or pretending to be crazy and all of that, which was one of the things that made me suspicious of that sort of image of her. But authorities investigate and they try to turn Van Loo's family against her, get them to sort of become witnesses for the prosecution, as it were. And they eventually absolve the provost marshals, absolve Van Loo, and their reasoning is that, oh, she's just a woman. She can't really have been doing the things that she's
Right.
rumored to have done. So, a big takeaway is that Van Loo was protected in some ways by the sexism of these Confederate authorities who couldn't imagine that an old spinster, lady could be the spy master. At that point, she'd already helped people, break out of Libby prison and the Dahlgren reburial, and she was in daily contact with Grant. I mean, there was, an absurd, um, malfeasance on their part, not to realize what she was
Right.
capable of, but they didn't. And I should kind of mention a couple other things. Um, we referred to Gene referred to the kind of difficulty of accessing sources in women's history and so on, and that's all true. And one can add that it's not just that this history was forgotten and sort of, buried under the inevitable rubble that comes with the passage of time. It was pushed out of view by the lost cause mythology, the mythology
Right.
that romanticized this Confederacy and romanticized slavery and put up the statues on Richmond's Monument Avenue to Lee and Jackson and all that. The purpose of those statues was to say there's one official way you can remember this war, and that's as a war of Confederate heroism and unity and righteousness and so on. And any memory that's not that memory has no place in public spaces. And so those statues were meant to be screens blocking the real history of the South, the complex history of the South, from public view, lest anyone be inspired by Van Lew
That
and
is
Richards to dissent. On that note, Van Lew will write a friend in 1891 after the Robert E. Lee statue goes up on Monument Avenue and say, this is my final straw. I now feel that this is no place for me. Now, this is someone who's lived in this city through a war, through Reconstruction. Again, Van Lew appointed postmaster of Richmond. She's very controversial in that role because she's supporting black rights and women's suffrage and so on from that political position. But it's the putting up of the Lee statue that's the last straw for her, because it's a way
yeah.
of saying, you all don't count, the rest of you. You don't count. You don't count as Southerners. You don't count as citizens. Your stories don't count. We're going to push them aside. So these acts of recovering Southern unionism, I think Gene has implied this in all that he said. The stakes are high.
Right.
Remembering this story, because it's a counter narrative to that lost cause narrative that basically allowed for only one orthodox
Right.
orthodoxy. Yeah.
And I am, Lord knows I'm not a historian, but I would just add to it the KKK and the
Of course.
1876 and
Yeah.
the compromise and the of what took place in the
Yeah, yeah. And
Reconstruction.
I mean, I could,
And
I
that
could
and
piggyback.
that
Yeah,
just and then it was, Katie bar the door in terms of the way the history would be told,
totally.
written, uh so that was definitely part of the thing. And
Yeah,
that's
that was the KKK. Van Lew received death
right.
threats from white
Yeah.
supremacists, and one of the things I found in my book, to Gene's point about the postmaster career, is that the rumors that Van Lew is unhinged and crazy and unreliable and hysterical, or an old script for bringing down women and power, or women who aspire to power, that comes along during Van Lew's postmastership, when the men in her own party and the men on the other side want her out of the job because it's a lucrative
Right.
political position, a lucrative
Right.
patronage plum. They begin to say Elizabeth Van Lew is crazy. And as I explained in my book, by the last years of her life, she did behave skittishly in public, and she had reason to. She felt that she was in enemy territory again. African Americans were her friends and supporters, but white Richmonders, unreconstructed white Richmonders hewing to the lost cause view of things, were hostile. And so that just contributed to the myth of her craziness, her the fact that she was understandably paranoid in the last years of her life.
I mean, one of the reasons I used the sister-in-law in the opera was because, what's happening in terms of the community, as Liz was just mentioning, in terms of um, her place, being threatened by the community and they're being investigated and such. It was happening in her family. I mean,
Yeah,
and
right.
that is so. And as I said before, though, with opera, it's about the people. And I thought it was a very, you want to watch people, and when this is more of like a nuts and bolts of like writing an opera, but you want to watch people make decisions on
Hmm.
in real time in front of you in an opera or in the theatrical setting. It's interesting. I mean, the most famous one is To Be or Not to Be, of course, where a person really
Hmm.
decide whether they're going to live or die. But you want to watch people make these decisions in front of you and wrestle with them. What are they going to do? And Mary Callie in the opera. Uh, wanting to turn her sister-in-law in, but then and then saying, "Wait a minute, like if I could be implicated in this, and
Hmm.
my money and my she was from a poor, as I remember, Liz, this has been a long time since I read your book, but she was from a poor family, and she married into this very very wealthy family. I mean, I want I did go when I went to Richmond. I went to the site of where the mansion was. The mansion was there until around 1916, as I understand, when it was torn down and they put up a women's school. And I went up there, and it's this, it's an incredible vista from that spot.
Hmm.
And at the bottom of that hill is where the slave auction was held. So, and then you could walk onto the Confederate White House from there. So it's all, it's an amazing part of history. And
Yeah. And it's important, just to follow up on what Gene said, and the opera, I haven't had a chance to see it, but I did read the libretto some. It was wonderful. It's so good about both showing that these women had a common cause, the cause of union and abolition, but there was a big gulf between them, a big
right.
gulf in racial privileges and power and wealth. And one way to think about that gulf is that Van Loo's unionism is on some level rooted in a nostalgia for an imagined American republic that existed before controversies over slavery and the secessionists'
Right.
rebellion had shattered that union. Mary Richards's love of union, her patriotism is not rooted in nostalgia. It's rooted in a vision of an unfulfilled union that had
Right.
that America's ideals fulfilled in the future. And that's a for all they had in common, all the shared risks, those are two very
Right.
different views of the world.
And also, I mean, I just wanted to put it out there that, I think for even, I can't, let's just be direct about it, even for, in quotes, good white people who are trying to do their best and are in fact being incredibly courageous in the case of Elizabeth Van Leeuwen, what she undertook still, like, you come from where you come from, and her, there's all kinds of racism, and
Hmm. Hmm.
it's threaded through. That's one of the tragedies of it, is that it's threaded through. It's in the water,
Yeah.
and of and that's what I wanted to kind of explore in the piece, and until more recently, when a letter emerged showing that she was actually in touch with Elizabeth Van Leeuwen after when she was asking for money. That came out after I wrote the opera. Up until that point, I had never heard of her actually again contacting Elizabeth Van Leeuwen again, which is what made me, when I was writing this thing, uh, go in the direction I went.
And it sounds like the story it's going to continue. We're going to new information is coming out all the time. And I
Yeah.
know Liz, you mentioned Lois Levine.
Yeah.
She's of course written a novel, a historical novel about Mary Bowser, The Secrets of Mary Bowser. But she's in the process of writing work of nonfiction, which is a biography of enslaved women during the war, using Mary as kind of a narrative, a through line to tell a broader story. And I really look forward to that.
You know,
Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, nobody ever gets the last word. That's as it should be. And we, as Gene knows this well, whatever, we move on to new projects, but the projects don't leave us behind. They keep pulling us
yeah,
back.
yeah, and also I just, you do your best, and but when you're certainly when you're doing something, in my case, historically sourced, but not a history, where things change, and you just have to roll with it and know that this is, you did your best as you were doing it. But I think that again, the pivotal story that we're trying to tell is a personal story, and so that's why I think it can survive historical you know, uh, new information
Of course.
emerging.
And I mean, the point, as you said, is to capture the emotional reality and for whatever, uh, you know, uh, uh, little details,
Right.
one can reinterpret to have captured the reality that the relationship is complicated and that the
Right.
work is risky and momentous. That's the core of it. If you've
That
done
is the
that,
core
you've
of it.
succeeded. You know what I mean?
Well,
And you have,
well, thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate that very much. But I'm looking forward to seeing this Virginia opera interpretation. It'd be great.
Well, I want to echo one of our attendees tonight, Carolyn Pitts. I want to echo her words with grateful to both of you for bringing the story to light, so we can acknowledge the contributions of these brave women, and want to echo that sentiment. I want to be respectful of both of your time, and we could have a few minutes here if there were maybe a question from the audience. This would be the time to use the raise hand feature if you wanted to, or type your question in the Q&A section. If not, that's totally fine. We've had a wonderful conversation, and I might, if I don't see a raised hand, I might just go ahead and give us the closing question. And for me, that would be, what are the lessons for today to take away from the book, to take from the opera? At a recent discussion surrounding intelligence, we had one of the historians mentioned the attempts at abducting Jefferson Davis, that was something that was happening at one point. And he said something about, can you see modern day parallels at abducting the president of another territory? What are the lessons that we carry forward from these stories?
Well, but I'll just the only thing that pops to mind right now is how complex reality is, and how many tributaries are flowing into the stream that make up how history moves forward. And it's so easy to fall into the cliche of what happened, and these people were good, that person was bad, it's as I said, and I've said to the actors who are doing it, like, and we have there's a bad guy in the opera, the home guard guy, Travis, that guy called Travis, and he is bad. He's racist and so forth. From his perspective, I'm not saying anything, but from his perspective, he doesn't view it that way. It's and I even put, like, his brother's killed and is tortured in the war. And he's, it's everything is complicated, and I think even among uh, the sides we're rooting for, the people we are, and I think this probably extends to all of us in today's uh, even in today's politics. Just like to respect the complexity of different people's stories, and how hard it is to really understand things.
I could easily elaborate on that by saying, people are multidimensional. We tend to reduce them to one dimension. I've written now two biographies of a sort of maverick, and I'm working on a third of Clara Barton. Talk about a great subject for an opera.
Yeah.
And in all cases, Van Lew and James Longstreet, the Confederate who became a supporter of Reconstruction, and Barton, I choose those three because they're the ones I know best, but there are endless examples of this. These complicated lives with all these sharp edges tend to get rubbed down and reduced to some kind of
Yeah.
one-dimensional image, and oftentimes it's to minimize that person again, so they can't become an inspiration for other people who want to be change agents, to kind of domesticate them and
Mm,
shrink, this happened to Van Lew, the razor sharp spy master becomes the crazy old crone on the hill, you
right.
know. I think we should guard against that. And then the other thing I'll say is that, and the opera speaks to this too, the Union that won the Civil War, that ended slavery, that defeated secession, it was a coalition, and a coalition of people with oftentimes quite divergent interests that came together to win this war. And the importance of coalition building is just something to take away from this. I mean, the opera speaks implicitly to the fact that because there is a gap between Van Leeuwen and Richards, when the war is over, the fault lines in the coalition, become really visible again. But what people who form coalitions can do, even across political divides, is one of the sort of messages of this as well, and the
Mm.
the, the possibility of unlikely alliances.
Well, I can't thank you both enough for agreeing to be with us tonight to share the story of Elizabeth and Mary Jane and this opera, the book behind the opera, and all the history. It's a rich history that we have in the state, and Virginia Opera is thrilled to be giving the East Coast premiere of this opera. And so want to encourage everyone on the call, if you haven't read the book yet, read the book. It's fantastic. And get any of Liz's other books. There are several books out there. Actually, Liz, what's the next book you're working on?
So
I'm
it's a
curious.
Clara Barton, the
That's the
great
Clara Barton. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
humanitarian. Yeah,
When
yeah,
will
yeah.
that
Wow.
be out? When would finish that?
Hopefully a year from March.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah,
All right.
Well,
yeah,
toy, 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 for that, as
yeah.
we say
Right,
in
right.
opera. And Gene, we look forward to seeing you very
Looking forward
soon.
to it. Yep.
And thanks to everybody out there. We'll see you at the
Thank you.
opera.
I
Thanks.
look forward to seeing it. Great to meet you
Take
all.
care. Nice
Great
to
to
meet
meet
you.
you.
Take care. Thank
Good
you.
night.